Remember in the last lecture how I said that the cell is the basic unit of life? That's because the cell is literally the smallest thing that performs all of the functions an organism needs to have to be considered alive. A single-celled organism uses energy, maintains homeostasis, reproduces, responds, and has adaptations that are the result of millions of years of evolution. However, you probably know that cells are still made of stuff. That stuff is matter, anything that occupies space and has mass. The cell is the smallest unit that can be considered alive, but it's made up of plenty of things that by themselves are not considered alive. That would be the cell's organelles, like the Golgi apparatus, or mitochondria, or the DNA that's in the nucleus. So anything we study in biology, plants, animals, bacteria, single-celled organisms, they're alive and have at least one cell. In multicellular organisms like you, there's cellular hierarchy and organization as cells of similar types form tissues, tissues of similar functions form organs, and organs work together in organ systems like your respiratory system. However, those cells still have plenty of non-living components like their membranes, their organelles, and even the water they contain in the cytoplasm. That's all made up of matter. The food and minerals that living organisms need to survive aren't living, but they're also made up of matter. My point is that everything that occupies space and has mass is made up of matter. Both living organisms and obviously non-living things like rocks are made up of matter. Matter can be organized into elements, basic substances that can't be broken down by natural means. You're probably familiar with some elements like oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. These are actually the three most abundant elements that make up your body. You're probably pretty familiar with calcium as well, although it only makes up about 1.5% of your body. You've probably heard you need to eat more calcium for healthy bones at some point in your life, although someone probably exaggerated the amounts you need to eat. Still, you need to consume calcium in some form, like in dairy, because it's a requirement to build and maintain healthy bones. All of the elements in your body have come from the food you've consumed or the air you've breathed. Generally speaking, elements are rarely found on their own in nature. Usually elements join together with other elements to form compounds. Water, with its chemical structure of H2O, isn't an element, but a compound of two elements, hydrogen and oxygen. When writing about the elements, it's normal to symbolize them with a 1 or 2-letter symbol. Carbon is usually signified as the letter C, whereas calcium is standardized as 2 letters Ca, where the second letter is always in the lowercase. When chemical reactions are written, we normally don't write out the whole element, but we use these shorthand symbols, as I've done here, to show the bonding of sodium, which is symbolized by Na, and chlorine, which is symbolized by Cl, to form salt or sodium chloride, which is written out as Na and Cl, the combination of those two elements to form a compound. Humans have recognized that items made of different elements behave differently for thousands of years. We knew that gold, symbolized as Au, would melt at a different temperature than silver, symbolized as Ag, for example. But it wasn't until the 1800s and early 1900s that we began to figure out why elements behave differently. Each element has its own atom, and the different structures of those atoms determine the characteristics of the element. If you held a chunk of pure 100% gold in your hand and started dividing it into half over and over again, you'd eventually reach a point where all that was left are identical gold atoms. The same would happen with a chunk of pure silver. Gold atoms are physically different than silver atoms, and the specific structure of gold atoms, silver atoms, carbon atoms, or any other element's atoms determine the properties of that element and how it interacts with other elements. By the way, it's a good time to mention that any drawing I make here of atoms or their parts isn't a truly accurate representation. Same goes for any image you see in your textbook. It's pretty much physically impossible to draw an atom accurately, but to help you learn and get ideas across, these representations basically work. In reality, electrons, protons, and neutrons are not the same size, and electrons don't neatly orbit in circles. There's some other stuff, but yeah, just know these are representations. Let's take a look at the basic parts of an atom, the subatomic particles. the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons. At the center of the atom, you'll find the nucleus of the atom, not to be confused with the nucleus of a cell. Sometimes in biology, terms get reused in a way that frustrates students, but hey, I'm not the one who made these up. In the nucleus of the atom, you'll find two of the three subatomic particles, the protons and neutrons. Protons are subatomic particles that carry positive charge, so I add a little plus sign when I draw them. Neutrons are subatomic particles that carry no charge, so I draw them with an equal sign. The protons and neutrons are generally held together by atomic forces to make the nucleus, which is where almost all of the density of the atom is located. Now we have some important definitions that we use to determine some basic characteristics of different elements and their atoms. The atomic number of an element determines the number of protons an atom of that element has. Carbon has an atomic number of 6, so it always has 6 protons. You can never change the number of protons or the atomic number of an element. If you do, you no longer have that original element. It's probably best to make a study note in your brain that says the atomic number tells you the number of protons. Carbon will always have 6 protons. You can't have a carbon with 7 protons. Oxygen has an atomic number of 8, so oxygen will always have 8 protons. Now we get to our second important number, the atomic mass. If you add up the two subatomic particles that are in the nucleus, the protons and the neutrons, you get the atomic mass of an atom. So atomic mass and atomic number refer to different things. Keep them separate when studying. Outside the nucleus, you have the third subatomic particle. These are the electrons. You might be wondering, why do we add together the protons and the neutrons to get the atomic mass, but not the electrons? Doesn't the electron contribute to the mass of an atom? Well, technically it does, but the thing about electrons is that they are so much smaller than the protons and neutrons that they don't really contribute to the atomic mass of an atom. They're that tiny. Like I said, the drawings I'm making are useful, but totally inaccurate in this regard. In no way are electrons anywhere near the size of the protons and neutrons. Additionally, an important thing, electrons carry negative charge. That's why I draw them with a little minus sign. While you can't change the number of protons in the atom of a specific element and still have that same element, you can change the number of electrons and neutrons and still have an atom of the same element. Carbon always has to have 6 protons, but you can change the number of electrons and neutrons and still have a carbon atom. The first of these variations we'll make is to the number of neutrons. Elements can have atoms with varying numbers of neutrons, and these different forms are known as isotopes. Now's probably a good time to mention the periodic table, this massive chart that organizes all known elements by their properties. I'm not going to draw it here, but I will link a picture in the description below. The only reason I bring it up now is because carbon's entry on the periodic table relates to this conversation on isotopes. In the middle of the periodic box entry, you have the symbol C. At the top, you have the atomic number, which for carbon is 6. That's the number of protons in any isotope of carbon. Note that it's a whole number, no weird 6.0002 or something like that. At the bottom, you'll notice a number that's not a whole number. That's the atomic mass of carbon, and it's a weighted average of the masses of all the isotopes in carbon. Different isotopes of an element are not equally distributed in the universe. Because 99% of carbon atoms are carbon-12 isotopes, that atomic mass is very heavily weighted towards 12. However, the contributions of even small amounts of carbon-13 and carbon-14 are making the atomic mass slightly above 12. If I ask you, what is the atomic mass of carbon-13, the answer is 13. But if I ask you, what is the atomic mass of carbon, the answer isn't 12. You're accounting for all of the carbon isotopes in existence, so it's slightly above 12 at 12.0107. As a hint, when you see carbon-12 or C-12, that hyphen to the left of the number is telling you you're looking at a specific isotope of that element. That number also tells you the atomic mass of that isotope. So if I were to ask you how many neutrons are there in carbon-13, you should know that the atomic mass 13 minus the atomic number 6 for carbon, no matter what isotope, tells you that carbon-13 has 7 neutrons. Some isotopes are energetically unstable. Sometimes because their nuclei are too heavy or there's a large difference between the number of neutrons and protons. That's more chemistry stuff than I need you to know for this class. But as a result, that energetically unstable isotope decays and will give off particles and energy until it reaches a more stable configuration. This is known as nuclear radiation. You might think that all nuclear radiation is medically harmful, but that's not true. You're actually being bathed in nuclear radiation right now. It's just at levels that probably won't impact you. Here's a fun example of the usefulness of that nuclear radiation. Plants absorb carbon from carbon dioxide. A very small fraction of CO2 has radioactive C14 as the carbon atom. Plants will use that carbon to grow more of itself, so you end up with a plant that contains C14. That plant could get eaten by a deer, and the radioactive C14 is recycled into deer tissues like bones. We know that the half-life of carbon-14 is roughly 5,730 years, which means that it takes that long for half of your C14 in a dead organism to disappear. So if you look at the amount of C14 in a fossil deer bone and compare it to the amount found in a freshly dead deer, you can approximately estimate the age of a fossil using C14 radiometric dating. To summarize so far, the number of protons in an atom of an element never changes. Carbon's atomic number is 6. It will always have 6 protons. If that changes, you no longer have a carbon atom. You can vary the number of neutrons in an atom, and that gives you different isotopes. The sum of the protons plus the neutrons gives you the atomic mass of an atom. The atomic mass of an element is the weighted average of the atomic masses of its different isotopes. Now we have our last subatomic particle to discuss in detail, and that is going to be the electrons. Electrons have negative charge, they are tiny, and they are located in energy shells. These shells are filled with electrons and are filled according to certain rules. The first shell can only fit 2 electrons, and the second shell can only fit 8 electrons. If an atom has 6 electrons, 2 of those will go into the first shell, and then the remaining 4 will go into the second shell. The second shell can only fit 8 electrons. So if an atom has 10 electrons, 2 go in the first shell, and then it completely fills its second shell with the remaining 8. If an atom has 11 electrons, 2 go in the first shell, 8 go in the second shell, and then 1 goes into the third shell. There are certainly more complicated electron shell filling rules, but for the purposes of general biology, 2 in the first shell and 8 in the second shell will get us where we need to be. For the elements we'll be using in this class, we're also going to go with another generalization known as the Octet Rule. If an atom has more than 2 electrons and fills more than the first shell, it is most stable when its valence shell has 8 electrons, despite whether it actually has more or less than 8 electrons in its valence shell. The valence shell, by the way, is the outermost electron shell. So like I said again, this is a generalization, and if you happen to be taking intro chemistry at the same time as this course, there are a lot more complicated rules, and you should default to your chemistry professor. But for the biology class, Octet Rule is fine to use. We can see the Octet Rule in practice with 2 atoms, first starting with sodium, symbolized by the symbol Na. Sodium has an atomic number of 11, which means it has 11 protons. You'll also have the same number of electrons as protons starting out, so also 11. Fun fact, the atomic number not only tells you the number of protons, it also tells you the number of electrons in an atom that has no charge. 2 go in the first shell, 8 completely fill the second shell, and then the valence shell has this one awkward leftover electron. Now we can look at the situation in chlorine. Chlorine has an atomic number of 17, which means it has 17 protons and also 17 electrons. 2 are going to go in the first shell, 8 are going to go in the second shell, and then the third shell is only going to have 7. The most logical thing to happen is for sodium to donate its one awkward one to chlorine to help chlorine complete its valence shell. Once sodium gets rid of that one awkward electron, that third ring poofs away and sodium has fulfilled the octet rule. However, when you do this and you get rid of an electron or you accept an electron, you create an atom that has charge, and this is known as an ion. In sodium's case, although sodium got rid of an electron, it still has its 11 protons that are standard. It now has 11 protons and 10 electrons. This means that it has more positively charged particles, so now it overall has more positive charge. We say that you now have a sodium ion, and technically, since you have a positive sodium ion, you have a cation. When we have a positive ion, by the way, you use a plus sign. Chlorine has the opposite problem. Chlorine has now accepted an electron, it satisfied its octet rule, but now it has more electrons than it does protons. This means that it has more negatively charged particles. This means that you are now having an ion that is negatively charged, symbolized with a minus sign. We call this an anion. So you have created these ions, and this is all due to the fact that electrons are going to travel to fulfill the octet rule to get to that stable number of 8. In the next video, I'll show you what happens to these ions and how they might bind together. And we'll talk a little bit about chemical bonding, which further goes into detail about the travels of electrons.